Our group, inspired by the Marshall Webb podcast hosted by the Wisdom Project, sought to find out the psychological risks that the descendants of Holocaust survivors face, if any. This research is crucial in order to address the long-lasting emotional and mental effects the concentration camps had on its prisoners and to further research the effects of PTSD in general. After researching the effects of the concentration camp on the prisoners themselves, we found that many survivors were left with incredible amounts of emotional trauma, psychological impairment, and mood disorders. Inspired by this research, we sought to find out how far these repercussions stretched. In many cases, the children of the survivors were prone to contracting these issues from their parents through trauma transfer. This shows that even after the Nazi reign fell and the concentration camps were liberated, the former prisoners still faced a future of great adversity. An article by Tori Rodriguez focuses on the findings of the research done by Rachel Yehuda. Rachel Yehuda is a researcher in the field of epigenetics and the intergenerational effects of trauma. In this article, Tori Rodriguez compares stress levels in Holocaust survivors and their descendants to other Jewish men, women, and children of the same age. The results of her experiment provided an excellent answer to our research question, which sought to find the long-term psychological effects the next generation faced. The offspring of survivors reported lower cortisol levels, a hormone that helps the body return back to the normal state after traumatic experiences. The low levels are consistent with victims of PTSD. Survivors' descendants also reported high levels of a specific enzyme which allowed their body to maximize glucose storage, allowing the individual to survive longer without food. This shocking evidence led our group to believe that if the second generation could be apt to physical abnormalities, that the possibility of psychological illness must be great. Due to the lack of these enzymes and hormones, unborn babies have to protect themselves from their mother's bodies while in the womb. If any genetic issue or mutation were to occur in the mother's bodies, causing the fetus to not be able to produce cortisol-destroying enzymes, then the cortisol in the mother's body could force a miscarriage by killing the fetus. This can make it nearly impossible for many of these survivors to even have children to begin with. This experiment was a breakthrough for our research into the descendants of concentration camp survivors. Another article provides insight into survivor syndrome and the effects of trauma transfer. The dissertation by Anna Kolodner provides evidence corresponding with survivor syndrome, which describes the psychological effects of the Holocaust experience. However, the main focus of this piece is the effect on the children of the survivors from the Holocaust. The article also focuses on the socialization of the survivors and how they influence their children when conflicting values and norms come up. The article basically states that the children of Holocaust survivors are going to have similar views as their parents due to the way they were raised. We talked to Will Schultz, a student at the University of Kentucky, about what it was like being raised by descendants of Holocaust survivors. He had this to say.
But I know my parents raised me very strictly. Education was very important to me, and I always had a very strict set of guidelines. And so if things were looser beforehand, I'd certainly know things were strict now.
Will's interview was important for our research because it showed us that children are very likely to adapt the same set of morals as their parents, potentially setting the stage for trauma transfer. The article provides proof that these children grow up to become adults with secondary effects from the Holocaust linked directly to their parents. Some grow up seeing their parents being paranoid with nightmares from the Holocaust, or parents that have difficulty socializing with others due to lack of trust. It can be difficult for these children when they do become adults if all they know are the horror stories passed along to them from their parents. That could also cause permanent damage in their everyday life. Due to the fact that these children sometimes also grow up in a much more sheltered lifestyle compared to those of average children out of their parents' fear, it is easy to see how this would affect their social and relationship skills. They themselves could develop trust issues as well as standoffish behaviors that will put them at a disadvantage when trying to find jobs, keeping up in the work environment, and even learning in school. Lastly, we looked to the British Medical Journal that spoke to the lasting traumatic effects of the concentration camps. The British Medical Journal details the traumatic events like poor living conditions, harsh physical labor, and the mass murder that took place in the concentration camps, and how the lasting trauma not only affected the survivors, but their children and grandchildren as well. The torture that took place in the camp left survivors with devastating trauma, including PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. The article states that many of the survivors' children showed an intense need to act as redeemers for their parents, which caused them to exhibit feelings of guilt and helplessness. Children were also at a higher risk of developing mental and emotional disorders later in life. A study conducted within the article further proved a majority of survivors' children suffered from some type of mental disorder. This article gives us insight on how much the Holocaust impacted the further generations. This article details the impact of the Holocaust on the next generation of survivors of concentration camps. A study conducted within this article explains how children of concentration camp survivors were more likely to have mental disorders later in life and suffer from anxiety and depression. The study also showed how survivors with mental disorders from their experience are at an increased risk of emotional problems in their children. Children of survivors were at a higher risk to develop PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, and other mental health disorders. Many of the children developed a sense of guilt for their parents and wanted to understand the impact the Holocaust had on their life. This article showed a correlation in survivors' experiences and their children's guilt and mental disorders. Many of the children may feel responsible to gain justice for their parents' losses, which could result in rebellious and prejudiced behavior toward other ethnic groups that were involved, or that these kids could see as being associated with the cause of their family's anguish. This could cause several racial issues with the family's problems, and in turn hurting these children's families more than helping them. Not to mention that this would then carry problems onto the next generation and many to come. With a topic like the Holocaust or concentration camps, an image can be worth 1,000 words. The pictures about to be shown on the screen show the true horrors of the concentration camp, as well as the source of the psychological issues many survivors face. Images are a critical element when it comes to truly grasping a concept, since it doesn't just tell you what's happening, it shows you. The 3 images we've selected give us an in-depth look at the horrors and tragedies that occurred in the concentration camps during the Holocaust. They show us the terrible conditions the prisoners had to endure, some of the people who died during their time there, and survivors looking back at the heinous acts committed by their captors. Sadness and hopelessness is a common theme throughout these pictures, and even though some of the prisoners did survive, the physical and psychological trauma of their time in the concentration camps stayed with them forever. One can only wonder how the survivors lived the rest of their lives with this huge weight on their shoulders, and how that affected the way they raised their children. For example, the first image explores the mystery and thoughts behind the Holocaust through black clothing and a blank background, leaving a lot of room for variance. 2 men stare intently at what looks like a small hole or indentation in the ground before them. Trees in the background show the scene taking place in a wooded or forested area. The men are dressed similarly in dark clothing with long jackets and matching hats. The men are looking in the same direction, yet they are not directly next to one another. The color spectrum of the photo, black and white, suggests that the image was taken before the invention of color printing or photography, allowing us to estimate the time period and thus the atmosphere as to where the photo was taken. 2 survivors of the concentration camp reminisce on their time spent at the camp. The 2 men stare in dumbfoundment at the ashes and remains of their fellow prisoners. The men distance themselves from one another, each wondering why they were chosen to live when so many were gruesomely murdered in this mass genocide. The men show signs of disbelief and confusion in their expressions, while trying to fathom the extremity of the adversity they faced. The emotional distress these men faced will leave them with lasting psychological issues and pain. Although the camp had been liberated and the Nazi reign had finally come to an end, the men faced the risk of developing PTSD or other stress-related issues. The men are left to now try to make sense of the situation and move forward with their lives. For many Holocaust survivors, this included starting families. Many parents would stay silent and not tell their children about their experiences in the concentration camps. This, although it may be the better option, leaves the child to let their imagination run wild and can sometimes lead to serious consequences. With children come the responsibility of explaining the events they experienced in their time in the camp. The stories told by the parent to the child are likely to shock the child as well as create frustration or emotional disturbances that could last a lifetime. The child is then prone to developing more complex, severe psychological problems later in life. Before we get into that, we spoke to James Albinsetti, a German history professor at the University of Kentucky, who spoke to us a little bit about what Germany was like after the concentration camps were liberated. He had this to say.
In large measure, the world did not focus on the Holocaust until the 1960s. It's hard to imagine, but that in fact there was a sense just not to talk about it, that it was much more the issue of the war, and Nazi persecution of other groups has got as much attention.
We believe that the world may be focusing more on the effects of the war rather than the concentration camps could add to the psychological vulnerability of the survivors and thus their children. The next image on the screen shows people walking amongst their dead peers. The people seem to be looking around, noticing the dead bodies surrounding them. The dead can be seen wearing uniforms, while the living are shown in more common, everyday clothing. In the background of the photo, old, beat-up buildings can be seen. The black and white color of the picture suggests that it takes place before color photography was invented. The clothing that people can be seen wearing in the photo also show the age of the scene. The rut or valley in the center of the photo separates the people from one another. The survivors pictured in this photograph seem to be shocked by the presence of the dead body in front of them. Many of the people in the photo's eyes are fixed on the body, but their faces show little expression. Because of the overexposure to death, some of the survivors have become desensitized to the sight of a dead body. This desensitization could lead to future psychological issues for the survivors as well as their children. After the liberation of the concentration camps, many survivors went on to try and live a normal life, which included starting families. The survivors then faced the issue of explaining their past to their children or not. If the parent stays silent, the child has to attempt to grasp what happened to their parents on their own. If the survivor tells stories of their experience to their children, the child may be prone to trauma transfer. Regardless of the decision the survivor makes, the child is left with psychological trauma that may lead to more advanced, severe emotional problems in the future. Our last image shows the condition of the camps where many people were held prisoner during the Nazi reign. Unclothed and malnourished men are cramped in nasty living conditions within centimeters from each other. No women are present in this photograph. Sleeping side by side without room to even roll over. No pillows or covers to protect them from the harsh weather they might endure. The beds are stacked like bunk beds seen in kids' bedroom, but all connected against the wall like the grocery store. Their frightened faces look as if they never know what is to come next. The black and white aspect of the picture shows its age and history, a time period when color images were not around. This represents the living conditions in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. They were basically treated like animals sent to live in a barn. Imagine the psychological effects this would have on the survivors of these camps. Even worse, these effects could get passed down to the second generation of the survivors. So not only does it affect the parents, but their children as well. The process of parents telling their children about this unthinkable time in history is known as trauma transfer, referring to the many questions children have and why someone would do such an awful thing to people. However, causing children to be emotionally unstable or psychologically harmed. This image is present in a book called Night, which is written by a Holocaust survivor who explains all the hardships he went through. The author of the book is actually present in the photo on the second row towards the back. This book provides evidence from a survivor talking about the types of psychological effects it had on others and most definitely himself. From the research our group conducted, we can conclude that descendants of Holocaust survivors are more prone to psychological diseases and defects, including, but not limited to, PTSD, survivor syndrome, depression, and anxiety. The survivors themselves are put in a tricky situation when it comes to explaining their past traumatic events to their children. Regardless of the decision the parent makes, the child inevitably still faces some risk. Thank you for listening.